Okay, this is welcoming everybody to Imagine Spaces and to a very special event with author and poet Lynn Davidson, who's joining us tonight to discuss her latest book, Do You Still Have Time for Chaos? A book that I think we're going to be deciding tonight how it speaks to our interests in essaying and open-ended poetics. Lynn's a wonderful poet whose work I met first in the pages of PN Review and then read her collection Islander. Her most recent book is Common Land, and she makes me think of the words of Pico Iyer in this book of hers, Do You Still Have Time for Chaos? In the sense that Pico Iyer talks about the way that we might connect bridges between countries, between hemispheres, to bring these two places together, and how that can be achieved, and yet how one is always mindful of the bridge itself, its frailty, and yet its ability to connect us. I wonder if that might be one of the many themes we talk about tonight. Welcome, Lynn. Thank you again for being part of this. Thank you so much, Jeannie, for hosting us tonight. Over to you.
Lovely, lovely. I think, Lynn, we were going to begin just by asking you to say a little bit about you and your writing and where you're from and so on. As Kirsty says, you know, it's about bridges between places.
Yes, well, I'm probably quite obviously a Kiwi. I came to live in Scotland in 2016. And I had a few years back when COVID was here and then came back again. So definitely between two countries. I've got a grown-up son in Brisbane in Australia and a grown-up daughter in Wellington in New Zealand. I've written a little bit of fiction quite a long time ago now. I write essays and I write poetry, and I think I'm probably, or definitely at heart, a poet. So everything that I write, I think kind of has poetry at its heart. I teach creative writing. I live in that sort of perilous way that writers do, sort of cobbling together jobs and hoping they stay with me. Yeah, so that's me in a nutshell.
Lovely, thank you. Can you tell me anything about the thought behind, you know, because you're a poet, suddenly in front of me I have the book, which is not full of, I mean, it has poetics for sure, but it's not poetry, it's prose. And what was the germ of the thing that decided you to start on that?
Well, so I was, when COVID hit, I tried and failed to get home to New Zealand, back to New Zealand. In that sort of very scary initial time when the whole, I mean, I was living in the Royal Mile and I couldn't believe that there was just nobody on the Royal Mile, and it was, you know, there was ambulances, and we don't need to be told, we remember, I think, how scary and strange that was. And I tried to get home, and I had bought 3 different tickets and went to the airport twice, and with 2 bags, and then another ticket with 1 bag, and couldn't get on the plane, like borders were crossing as we spoke, sort of thing. So I was turned away from the airport. And after this 3rd attempt to get home, I decided that it was just too dangerous and I wasn't going to get there anyway. So this was a very frightening thing as somebody, you know, who was used to being able to get places she needs to get to, my New Zealand passport. So I went back to my flat, which I'd sort of dismantled because I thought I was going to be away and I didn't even know if I was coming back, and I'd given stuff away and got rid of stuff and dismantled a whole lot of stuff. And I went back to my flat and I thought, oh, right, because I was living on my own, and I thought I'll just try and remake my little home here. And what now? And I was kind of standing in the lounge and I had this sense of a presence coming into my flat. And it was my great aunt. It was my Scottish grandmother's younger sister, who actually I never met, but I heard about through my grandmother. And I'd seen photos of and things. And I knew that she'd had a very difficult life. And she'd had some complications in her life, which were similar to complications in my life, but her life had been a lot more brutal, I think. And I felt like she came into the room and she didn't come in as this sort of sweet spirit. She came in as somebody going, okay, well, here you are on your own. Who knows what's going to happen? You've always been interested in me. How about you do something with that? And at the same time as feeling sort of kind of encouraged in to start writing about her and finding out what I could about her life, she seemed to also be encouraging me to write about my own and the ways that our lives kind of slightly crossed over. And and she stayed with me the whole time I was there writing this work.
It's a lovely beginning. It really is. When I look at the book, when I first opened it, you have the family tree just inside, and I always think that's really welcoming and an invitation to come into a book. And I've circled where your grandmother is. Whoops, can't get my fingers to go the right way.
Yeah.
There we are. Nan, your grandmother, yeah.
Yes.
And Vida is along here. But quite a number in that generation.
You go on.
No. I think we thought you might begin by reading the first few pages, which everybody's had a look at. But it'd be lovely to hear them from you, if you'd like to do that. Yes. And then perhaps we can go on to talk about the title.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's lovely that you circled the names. And, you know, I've added a name here next to my younger kids' name because they've got a partner now, a long-term partner, and I wanted to include her. So I like that it's a kind of malleable thing.
Well, this book has actually made me behave in a way I've never done before, really. I've started scribbling in it and turning the pages down. I don't do that to books. So I find it really absorbing. Anyway, I'll let you get on and read the passage for us. It'd be lovely to hear it in your voice.
Okay, this is the first opening little piece. It's called The World's End. It was eerie to walk the deserted streets of Edinburgh's medieval old town and think about those other plague years. They seem to break through the imagined linearity of the lived world like a plant through cleared earth. Hello, you were always there ahead of us. I lived within the perimeter of the Flodden Wall that once encircled the old town, built in response to the Scots army defeat at the 1513 Battle of Flodden. The wall is almost entirely gone now, but it once reached around the back of the castle and passed along the bottom of my street, where there was a gatehouse called the Netherbow Port, or Furthest Gateway. This gate was the largest of 6, where those who could afford the tax could enter the city. Citizens of the walled city who didn't have the fee to return never left, and the crossroads at the bottom of the street I lived on was known as the World's End. Now that COVID had found us, the famous World's End pub, usually rammed with tourists, had its windows boarded up. It felt like the World's End again. Alexander McCall Smith describes Edinburgh as a city of shifting light, of changing skies, of sudden vistas, and it is. Streets become bridges arched over deep canyons. Someone steps out from a close you didn't know was there. Spring arrives and overburdens the cherry trees outside of the Canongate Kirk. Winter lifts the roof off the world and doubles the sky's blue. At that moment, the city was suddenly empty and seemed to be unfolding into its own history. I quelled fear by walking and by noticing the dates on heavy stone lintels above doors and the creatures in stone relief emerging out of the walls and over windows, and how they appeared now there was time to meet them. The way a single body walking down the Royal Mile looked to be threading their way through history, how it opened and closed around them like long grass. As I walked into Edinburgh's rising history, I began to have thoughts about my own, my recent past, and further back to where I came from, Aotearoa, Scotland. I stood in my kitchen, one shaking hand against the window, spanning tenement chimneys and the Salisbury Crags. I was pressed hard against the reality of some big later life decisions, and I was thinking that perhaps I should go home. Will I continue on reading the...
No, I think that's lovely. It sets you in place really nicely. The title of the book, I think it's such a wonderful title. It's Do You Still Have Time for Chaos? It's that when I started reading, I thought, bring on the chaos. Let's see where it takes us. Do you want to say a bit about what you thought about that title?
Yes. In 2018, I went to an exhibition at the Talbot Rice Gallery called Tremble, Tremble. And it was by an Irish artist called Jessie Jones. And she'd made it around a time of another big abortion debate in Ireland. And it was about the oppression of women, basically. And she had installed it in different countries, different cities, and the Edinburgh installation was very much around the persecution of women as witches. And she had various things like a scold's bridle and, the Malleus Maleficarum and demonology and all of that stuff. It was a fantastic exhibition. It was so haunting. And it had a soundtrack. And in the soundtrack was the artist had sort of slightly mashed together testimony from women who had been tried as witches in the courts. And I particularly heard this one woman whose name is Temperance Lloyd, who was tried as a witch in sort of the mid-1600s in Devon, I think. And she seemed to be laying down this sort of challenge. I'll read to you what she said, this short quote. So there was this sort of giant witch who's this fantastic Irish actor, this woman with long white hair, very muscular, strong, and she was on these sort of floor to ceiling facing screens when you walked in. And she was quoting Temperance Lloyd, and she said, "Did I disturb ye, good people? I hopes I disturb ye. I hopes I disturb ye enough to want to see this, your house, in ruins all around ye." She was in the courthouse. "Have you had enough yet, or do you still have time for chaos?" And when I started writing this book, I thought that has to be the title, because the book is a lot about chaos, the scariness of it, as in COVID and all of that. And also my own experiences as a poet and as a single parent, living a very financially precarious life. And in terms of Vida's life, she also had a lot of difficulty in her life, and chaos came in a lot. But I also felt like chaos comes for us wherever we are, whoever we are, whether we like it or not. So we might as well make room for it. And I felt that also sometimes it brings quite rich things with it, quite life-changing in a good way, things with it.
I think that thing about when you talk about the witches and about that thing about, I can't remember what they were called. They were called what we would call now awkward women, but they were, noted as being difficult women, apart from anything else. And when we meet Vida in the book, you realise that she belongs in that category of the difficult woman, the one who has a mind of her own and wants to make her own mark in the world. So what interested me about it right from the start was the form of the book, because it's in fragments and short essays, and it moves from place to place and so on. Do you want to say a little bit about how you put it together? The form that it took, because it doesn't feel like a memoir all the time. It sort of moves across genres.
Yeah. So it's in very, very short, I suppose, essays, and then there's a few poems in there, and then there's things that could be prose poems or not. They kind of are a bit blurry. I didn't sit down with a plan. I never do with writing. I never kind of know what's going to happen, but I just knew that I wanted to have, and I kind of knew that it would be in short pieces because that's kind of how I write. But I knew that I was writing about my life and Vida's life. And I knew that I wanted to bring the past and the present into conversation with each other. So it wasn't going to be linear. I think with poetry, like, you drop down into moments. It's archaeological, as opposed to prose, which tends to more towards linearity. And so I think a lot of the pieces drop down into moments, and I want those moments to show something about what I'm trying to say about my life or Vida's life. And sometimes even I think if you put the past and the present together and let them be in conversation, even the future can sometimes come in and make a little entrance. So I was interested in seeing what the parts would do when they talk to each other, kind of in the way that a poem, a very pared back poem, the language gets to kind of really be in conversation with itself. Yeah.
When you describe it like that, the past and present in conversation, for me, it wasn't just the past and present. There was always this sense of movement, of traveling, of the various members of your family who moved backwards and forwards, and yourself. You were, throughout this conversation, you're moving a lot between places and going back to your childhood. Do you want to say a bit about that, about the generational shifts and your own shifts?
Yes, well, in 1926, a lot of my grandmother's family went out to New Zealand. It was between the wars, and my great-grandfather had been a farmer from a very long line of Aberdeenshire farmers. But I think the Depression was making things very difficult, and he ended up sort of just leasing a patch of land and also running a pub. So they ended up, instead of living in the big old farmhouse, they were living above a pub. And They went out to New Zealand in the hope, I suppose, of a better life, which is what we do when we move to a different country. And my great-grandparents went, my grandparents with their first child and various other members of their family. There were quite a few of them. And then some of them stayed and some of them came back because the Depression followed them out to New Zealand. And I think a farm in the South Island of New Zealand is a very different thing to a farm in Aberdeenshire. So it just didn't quite work out for some of them. So my great-grandparents and some others went back, including Vida, who I write about. Yes, I've always felt a strong pull back to Scotland, which is something that I'm one of 4 siblings. My brother kind of felt, but my 2 sisters I don't think has felt. So it's quite strange. It hit some of us and not others. I always felt slightly like, although I love Aotearoa, New Zealand, feel very connected to it, I felt like I needed to come back here to, well, actually, when I came back here, I had this strong sense of, and I had this the first time I ever visited Scotland when I was 19. I was doing what in New Zealand we call the OE, because we're so far away from everything. Young, kids like in their late teens, early 20s do their overseas experience and they go and live in London for a year or something. So when I was over, I just went to visit relatives in Aberdeen, and I remember crossing from England into Scotland and like, oh my goodness, I kind of recognise this place. I wasn't expecting to. And when I came back here in my mid-50s to live, I felt like I'd come back to and kind of met a self that had been waiting for me here. So I have done a lot of backwards and forwards, it's true. I've lived in Melbourne, I've lived different parts of New Zealand, and now here. I don't really know why I'm a travelling person, but...
Yeah, it's very much a theme that runs through the book. And we didn't speak about it when we met the other day, but I read this afternoon about the sinking of the Rangitani. Is that the right pronunciation of the...
Yeah, good.
Can't put a date on it, but it must have been wartime, I think, because it was sunk by, I think, during the war. But
Yeah.
You put a line in there. There are heartbreaking passages in this book. There really are. And this line on page 180 was about a part of your family who were on that ship at the time. And you say, oh, little family, transporting precious names across perilous oceans on the warm animal bodies of children. It's just, it was just that moment of the risk involved of traveling those long distances at that time. And in 1926, the same, because it took so long, the perilous oceans.
Yes, and that boat was sunk on the return journey. So it brought part of my family over, and they, it was my uncle's family, and his little daughter was called Vida after my aunt Vida. There was a Stuart after my uncle Stuart. There was a John after my uncle John. So all of these kind of repeated names.
Yes. And they were being carried on this ship all that distance. Yes. Oh, it was lovely.
Thank you.
Each little section in the book has a title, and some of them could just be the titles of poems. And although they're not structured like poems, there are poetic bits in them. Did you write them first and then think about what you were going to use as a title for each section, or did the titles come first?
I don't think the titles came first. I think I probably wrote them and then the titles came along. Mostly that's how it would have happened. Yeah.
It's really nice because I was reading the titles one after another, and then you get a sense of linearity, but it's not the linearity of a story, it's the linearity of emotion and effect and all that kind of thing. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, well, I wanted to have a sense of things happening. I wanted a sense of sort of movement and cadence and kind of breath in the work. And even though we're going backwards and forwards in time, I think the backwards and forwards are shining lights on each other. Well, hopefully that's what they're doing. And they're also creating a shift in pace and, you know, focus a little bit. So they're giving a kind of a lift and fall to it.
Yes, yes. That thing about place is so enormously important, because you talk about Aberdeenshire and, you know, without giving any spoilers, you returned to the pub later on, didn't you? And didn't have the experience that you might have expected as we go and visit places which have inhabited our imagination for a long time.
So I was researching during COVID, so I couldn't go anywhere. But I dived into, what's it called? Ancestry.com, and nearly lost myself in there. It was just so many rabbit holes, printing out screeds and screeds of, you know, relatives from hundreds of years ago. But now I've forgotten your question. Sorry.
But it wasn't really a question. It was about when you returned to the pub in Lumfannon. Yeah.
That's right. And so one of the things, when I was 19 and I went to stay with my great uncle, who was the one person from that family who didn't go out to New Zealand, he showed me around where my grandmother used to go to church and Sunday school, and where my great grandfather's pub was, and we went and had a drink in there. And I thought, when I was doing all the research around them and finding out what I could about their lives, because it was pretty sketchy, I thought, when I can move around, I want to go to the Macbeth Arms in Lumfannon, which was this pub that my family owned, and stay the night there. And I had this image in my mind of, you know, like a crackling fire in the fireplace and a friendly barman being fascinated by the fact that my great uncle used to own this pub. And, you know, my grandmother was, you know, partly grew up there and everything. And when I finally got back, when I came back after COVID, it was quite scary. I got dropped off there by my a second cousin who I've met through writing this memoir, actually. She's Vida's granddaughter. And we drove around and we looked for ancestral homes, which we found. And then she dropped me off at the Macbeth Arms in Lumfannon. And I don't know if anybody's been there, but it's like, talk about your one-horse town. You know, it's absolutely tiny. It's in the middle of this gorgeous rolling Aberdeenshire land. But it was kind of the end of the day, and I had to like dash into a shop to buy a sandwich to eat. And rather than going into a welcoming pub, I was given a kind of code to unlock the front door of the pub, because for most of the time it's shut down, and because it was autumn, I think. And if it's not summer or spring, it's only open like 3 days a week or something. And I happened to be there on a day that it wasn't officially open, but I was still staying there. So it was just me. And I thought, oh, and another couple who lived there who I never saw, but I heard them rattling around. And it was quite scary. And I thought, well, I actually really hope my ghost family don't come and kind of hover around my bed. And I was quite freaked out by it all. The only, you know, and I obviously put this in the book, but the only upside of it was that I tried to go to this place that I'd read about, the place where Macbeth was buried, I think, before he was then disinterred and taken to, because Macbeth died in Lumfannon, and taken to Iona, but I didn't find it. But I had this sense behind me of my grandmother and Vida sort of following behind me quite cheerfully as little girls. and not needing me to be there at all. So the message kind of was, you've done your thing here, just get on with your own life, get back to sort of hanging around with the living. So that was a strange experience.
It was really fascinating to read it because for me it was rather like I kept hoping, and I don't want to drop spoilers in it at all about Vida's life, but I kept hoping, like you were hoping when you got there, for something that was in your imagination. In my imagination, things were going to go right for Vida, and it was all going to work out nicely. And of course, it doesn't necessarily. And that piece, when I read it, I thought that's just how it is. That what you hope for and what you imagine might be so frequently isn't. And you're left with, as you say, having to go back among the living about what's real, rather than what's floating around in our imaginations. I thought it was really powerful. So stitching it together, I have in my mind a picture of you with all these pieces, spread around, because there are many pieces in this book. But the way you've stitched them together, they flow. They really do. And I'm just wondering what that process was like, whether you move them around like a jigsaw.
I did at one point, of course, or actually more than once, printed all the parts out, and I sort of spread them all out and looked at them, and was thinking about how they could best talk to each other, and which parts seemed more live when I sat them beside each other. I knew that I wanted to start during COVID, when the world sort of stood still for a moment. But apart from that, I didn't really know how it was going to unpack. I just kind of wrote it, and I knew you were going to ask me about this, and my heart sunk a little bit, because I sort of can't really explain it very well, except that I'm sure that a lot of the stuff happens subconsciously, the ordering and the shuffling and the what comes next. And I think there's when you're working on a big project, a lot happens underground.
That's really interesting. Because when we chatted the other day, you said that when you're writing, you like that feeling of being a bit lost anyway, that you're just following the thought rather than having any kind of plan. And I certainly relate to that. I think if other people would like to step in at this point and ask any questions, I think it's just such a lovely opportunity to talk to you, Lynn, about the structure of what is such an unusual book. It really is. But other people leap in and comment and ask questions.
Can I ask a very general question? And it arises out of my reading of the book, and I did read all of the book on digitally as well, from my Kindle. The question is really, I suppose it's quite formless, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How elastic can a memoir be, if you like? And how is it different from, say, writing a personal essay or some description? Because one of the themes of one of the rich theme in your text is about spiritualism, and you go through the witchcraft and you go through some of the rituals, and then of course you also have the grandmother and Vaida coming as a kind of a presence, not even a ghostly presence, not even a metaphor, but really as a presence. So some of that made me think not like a full-blown magical realism, but a sense of the past actually being completely real, rather than it already has gone away. And I'm also thinking about the debates around memoir writing in terms of authenticity, fact-checking, and reality, really. A sense of, it must be real, it must be accurate, it must be authentic, things must have happened in that way, because there's a great debate between John de Agata, the lifespan of a fact, where people take him to task for saying, well, actually, this didn't happen. I fact-checked it. When when the essay was published in the New Yorker, someone was sent to fact-check everything he had written, and he said, well, this, I wrote 34 rather than 33 because actually 34 sounded much more rhythmic in the sentence I write. Oh, it didn't happen in Minnesota, it happened somewhere else, but that doesn't really matter. So how elastic can a memoir be?
Yeah, good question. The woman.
What's contract? I suppose behind my questions, what is your contract with the reader?
The woman who wrote she was launching my book, so this is her launch speech, and in it Lynn Jenner, and she wrote, a memoir is a wide doorway, but it always contains the preoccupations and interests, I think it was, of the writer. So it does contain my preoccupations and interests, including with things spiritual and how there's more to the world than what we, can see. And I was very careful about getting the facts right around other people's lives. And nearly everybody that I wrote, anybody that I wrote about, relatively substantially, I sent them my work to read it. And so I got it okayed by people. I didn't want to upset anyone. I didn't want to overstep boundaries. And there was tricky work in there, I have to say, including writing about one of my kids' fathers and, being careful of her feelings as well as being careful of my own feelings as well. My contract with the reader, I think, so, Vida is, I'm sure she's both there and in some ways not there, but she felt like a very physical presence to me. I wouldn't have made it up, and I also didn't want to make her up. So I wanted to be very mindful of her as her own person. And so I actually gave her own voice in a few parts, maybe 4 times in the book. And I know that's me writing Vida's voice. I know it's not actually her, but it felt like, it's quite hard to describe. It just felt in my bones like something she might feel, say, think. And so I don't feel uncomfortable about any of it when I think about my contract with the reader. I think there's nothing really made up in there, and more than anything, I didn't want to make up Vida. So yeah, I didn't want to make her up. So yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question very well, but.
I mean, I'm puzzling over it. It's just a general question about form in some ways. Readers come to text with expectations of sorts, and I know that a memoir does not have to be kind of to the letter of the law, things that have happened, and people sometimes talk about an emotional truth. But I'm also slightly, in this day and age, I'm also slightly worried, about kind of, I suppose, with the whole Trumpian thing about, well, that's a false fact, or, anyone can have any kind of truth that they like because it's just simply my truth rather than yours. So occasionally I get quite anxious about these particular problems.
I wonder if I could just jump in and spiral back to this issue.
Welcome back.
Memoir. I know, I'm so thrilled, but I was able to join you all by phone, so I've been completely keep catching up with the conversation, which has been really enjoyable. I wonder if we could get back to this issue of memoir and what we have here, because what we have in the discussion with Jeannie and Lynn is a really lovely sense of the tentativeness of this project, whether that's the fragment by fragment nature of its making, whether it's the uncertainties of the life itself being represented that are so back and forth that I kept losing touch of, losing track of which visit was that? And is that when she's going back to New Zealand or back to Edinburgh, and all of these kinds of lovely uncertainties. And I think as you talked too, it's like, how do you sum this book up? So yes, it's being described as a memoir, isn't it? But I think, Lynn, the reason we wanted you to join us on Imagine Spaces is because it's not a memoir. And I wonder if you might talk a little about the tensions between that form, because a memoir, surely, irrespective of the size of the doorway through which the writer walks, is nevertheless an accumulation of facts known about a life that are put together in a certain way as to create a shape. And it seems that there's something about this book that resists a shape. In fact, the title suggests it, doesn't it? It's inviting chaos and certainly representing precarity. So when you're thinking about the book, how might those tensions be articulated in it between this memoir form, which, the reader knows, as Gail was suggesting, the reader knows a little about what to expect, and there are notions of contract and so on, and a shape for sure. And this other thing, the essay, which is, as you said, a question that you're following endlessly and doesn't necessarily have an answer. Could you speak a little about that?
Yeah, so I guess as a poet, so I guess if I'm wanting to tell, when I started writing this book, I just told myself I wanted to stay with the uncertainty. That was one of my kind of touchstones. I want to stay with the uncertainty. And I'm not a person who feels certain about a lot of things. I feel uncertain about a lot of things. And that interests me, and the unknown interests me. And I wanted to leave space for uncertainty and the unknown, because that feels true about my life. And I experience my life as interweaving experiences. And in a way, I've kind of written it as interweaving experiences. It's probably not a memoir. And I started off calling these pieces essays. And then my publisher got nervous about me doing that, because I think my New Zealand publisher, because he was selling it as a memoir. So then I started calling them pieces. I just...
Let me say something here. I think, in trying to identify it as a memoir or something else, the memoir, as you rightly say, Gail, gives us a framework and that contract with the reader and all of those things. And we think that what we are reading is a series of facts and truth about somebody's life and so on. And this has never seemed like a memoir to me. It seems more like an impressionist thing that happens, and Vida living in your life with you, especially during COVID. And there's one moment when you say, and she was there, or perhaps she wasn't there at all. And I think, yeah, I can be there with you in the absolute uncertainty about anything in this book, because it flows. I said to you the other day that the pieces move past my mind a bit like clouds. They come and they go, and they change shape as well. There's a vein through it, which is about Vida and your relationship with your family and the movement of the family, like the clouds and all the rest of it. I gave up trying to work out who was going where and when. They were just moving. That was the important thing for me. It wasn't about, well, when was that? Which is why I can't remember when the ship sank. when the ship was hit, rather, and all that kind of thing, because the actual facts of the matter became less important as I got to know Vida, as you later out. And it's memoirs. It's not memoir for me anyway. What does anybody else? Do we have to make ourselves feel safe by being clear about what genre a book is? Would be my question.
Can I just say something to that? When Vida first kind of entered the room, as it were, she said something like, well, you could tell our stories, you could give your side of a story, sort of thing. And it was a chance to speak about our lives, her life and my life. And I wanted to not only speak about our individual lives, I wanted to speak about the wider context around our individual lives that created some of the circumstances of our lives. Because there's, like poverty doesn't happen in a vacuum. Vida's violent marriage doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so part of what I wanted my memoir, which is possibly not a memoir, to be doing is carrying the stories in a bigger context, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's funny to be pushed a bit in that direction and have to think about it a bit more.
And also, all of the things that you're saying are really lovely about, all kinds of the mysteries of making, right down to that idea of there being a kind of an amanuensis function, and you've got this kind of spooky, presence that's kind of guiding the writing. I mean, all of these things are fascinating for their own sake, but also how the world we live in is also a kind of guiding presence, as you just said. You did not imagine this as a memoir. The publisher was fearful to present it as things, fragments, essays, so it had to become a memoir on the shelves. And now one is forced to bring that word into the conversation and talk about it. So this is another aspect of the making process, isn't it? How the thing might change in your own mind once it becomes a book published, sitting on a shelf.
Yes. Yes. And, can the book find its own shape and get back to what it wants to be? I hope so.
I read a good novel recently, a very short novel by an American called Ben Lerner. The novel was called Transcription. And it's either a memoir disguised as a novel, or else it's a novel in the form of a memoir. And it ties in closely to what we have just been talking about. I won't go into the whole thing, but it's to do with how much latitude can there be in a memoir for fiction or embellishment or editing even. The inciting incident, if you like, is when the central character, the central narrator, is on his way to interview an august intellectual academic of great importance who is nearing the end of his life. The younger writer drops his phone in the sink at his hotel and it stops working. So he has nothing to record the interview on, but he is too embarrassed and confused to know what to say to the old man. So he gives the impression that he's is recording the conversation that he has with him. And this sets in train a sequence of events because, of course, his publisher wants to get the transcript of the interview so it can be published. And then he has to go to academic conferences to present what he's written. And it rolls out very painfully and embarrassingly, but very stimulatingly. It's a highly intellectual short novel that is all about these areas of truth and fiction and embellishment. And I can't wait to read your book, Lynn. And I'll be reading it partly with Ben Lerner's dilemma in my mind.
It's so interesting. Yeah, yeah. I love his book, The Hatred of Poetry. It's a lovely book about poetry and why people are so freaked out by it. Yeah.
I was intrigued by the title. I've only read this one by him,
Mm.
which was a Father's Day present, strangely.
Perfect. Yeah. I think, like with a poem, you don't get to truth by going through the front door. You get to truth by going through a side door. I think, and I suppose because I've been writing poetry for so long, that my inclination is to go through the side door always. That said, I don't feel like I play with truth and fiction, weirdly enough, because I have the ghost of my great aunt in there, who isn't there, but it all feels very true to me anyway. Yeah.
In the end, Lynn, you had the question that you put to yourself. As Catherine Mansfield says, it's so important that the question is put. That's what she got that from Chekhov.
Yeah.
Did you continue to put the questions to yourself by the time the book was finished, by the time you'd arranged all of those fragments? Did the questions persist, or did you feel that you had made something of a quilt of learning by having made the book itself?
It was actually very interesting for me to make the book and to look at it and see some sort of cause and effect things in my own life. It's like, oh, I can see why this happened now, because in my head, a lot of, some parts of my life have been like, well, why did I do that? Or why did I end up with that person? Or, and it's been a really, really interesting thing to write this and see some pattern that I could understand.
So to that extent, it is a memoir, isn't it, then? Because that is part of Memoir's raison d'etre. And the reason I said that about a quilt is because when you described your making process, that business of, which I loved, printing everything out and laying it on the floor and arranging the pieces and so on, and you had that lovely line about, how the pieces became most alive in terms of the, setting them in what order. But I was also thinking about those kinds of quilts that carry family histories. And so, a bit of fabric might come from a great grandmother, and that was her nightshirt, or this other bit came from, it was a remnant from a cushion or something. And this is the way that the life is put together piece by piece and then tells that story, which is the memoir, as opposed to the essay, which is constantly wanting to undo the stitching and undo the weave to get to the next question.
Yes, that's so true. That's so true. And I'm very interested in getting to the next question. And I'm so not interested in resolving things particularly. But I mean, in the publication here in Scotland, my last essay in this book, when I published it in New Zealand, was called Fairy Tale Ending, because I didn't know how to finish it. And I thought, Vida's life doesn't finish in it's not what you would hope for her. My life isn't quite finished yet. And so how do I finish it? I don't know how to finish it. So I thought, I'll write a fairy tale ending. So slightly ironically, sort of looking at a fairy tale book. And I quite liked how it ended. Vida and I just kind of bumped into each other in the street, and she took off, and I tried to follow her, and then she was out of sight, and that was it. And I was very, when I published it here, they wanted me to do an epilogue. Main Point Books wanted me to do an epilogue to update it, and I was so resistant because I just loved this ending where Vida just took off. And but actually doing the ending was very, very interesting, because I had to think, well, where am I now, and where is the story now? And that was when I wrote about going back to Lumfannon and the pub, and trying to do that thing of resolving, you know, I'll complete the circle, I'll go back to where my great grandparents lived, and etc. But it didn't work. It was resisting me, and so, you know, happily, I don't think there is a resolved ending. It's just like another drop into a moment. Yeah.
Could I venture?
On you go, Duncan.
Well, here's a funny thing, Lynn. I come from Aberdeenshire, a village called Turfins, which is next door to Lumphanan. And my great aunt and great uncle also owned the Macbeth Arms Hotel.
No way.
Yeah,
I love
from
that.
from the 1940s up to about 1960 or something like that.
Oh my
They were
God.
farming folk in Lumphanan, and at some point they decided they would take over the hotel, so they ran it for about 20 years.
Wow.
And so I grew up with all that Macbeth stuff. My grandfather used to tell me stories about Macbeth and his passage through the village, which he wasn't really a reader. And anyway, none of this stuff would be written down. So I can only think it was kind of oral history passed down for 900 years or so in the village. So I can tell you about, well, various things about Macbeth and where he died and all that stuff. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but I can tell you what the oral history was.
Wow. That's absolutely amazing.
When you mentioned Aberdeenshire, I was going to ask you which part of Aberdeenshire, but I didn't think it would be the very same pub that my family used to own.
That's crazy. That's just, yeah, that's wonderful. I love that. Yes, we should talk more.
Open up the book and keep writing.
I know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
I absolutely can't top that. I think that's just so wonderful. Because I love the way, I love the ending, and then the photograph of Vida at the end when she was at her most magnificent. I thought that was the perfect. But she was such a striking woman.
Striking, very stylish, a very modern woman. Yeah. In a not very modern world. Yeah.
No, but for women like Vida, perhaps things haven't changed all that hugely.
I think that's true. Yeah.
Can I ask another question about the making of this book? And going back to that, the pages on the floor and so on. So at that point, when you'd made certain decisions about what piece was going to sit next to what, was there an element of going back and taking chunks out, rewriting, changing?
There was a bit of that. Yeah. There was a bit of sculpting. Yeah.
I was going to say the opposite, Lynn. Was there a bit of messing it up? Because again, this word chaos comes through as a theme in your talk tonight, and it's there in the title. For my money, this book is about precarity, yes, and absolute vulnerability of being, you know, a jobbing writer. Is it about chaos? I'm not so sure. Precarity itself is linked to the idea of order, that we might have it, and we feel therefore precarious that we're not achieving it. Chaos is something that, I don't know what, comes roaring at us, would gobble up everything and throw all those pages into the air and rearrange them on the floor. So was it sculpting or was it messing it up?
Possibly more messing it up. I don't know. Yeah. It probably wasn't all that tidy to begin with, I imagine. So, yeah. But you're right that chaos is a very big thing. Like the world itself comes out of chaos, doesn't it? but also, you know, I was really interested to read people like Rachel Cusk writing about being a single parent and stepping, you know, being sort of stepping out of the light into the dark and looking into the windows of the houses of the two-parent families. You know, we all know there's plenty of not great two-parent families, but, you know, but that sense of kind of being on the outside of things. And I think that is a kind of chaos, because you can't control it. It comes at you to a certain degree. And because of the way that the world is ordered, it's not particularly ordered to look after certain people. And a lot of the time it's not ordered to look after women who step outside of the conventional norm. And Vida certainly did that. And to a lesser extent, I did that as well. And financial precarity brings chaos with it. You know, it definitely brings chaos with it. Because, you know, I guess chaos can be your car blowing up, or the fridge not working. It just kind of gets in the way of everything. It has an explosive effect. Yeah, so.
Does chaos result in a book, though? That would be my question. Is it possible in the end to make art out of a state of chaos? Is it possible to resolve that unness with the made thing?
Yeah. Yeah, because chaos is about sort of things flying apart. Yeah. I guess I'm writing about it, but I'm not making it in a chaotic way.
I certainly love the way all of these questions come up in this book. All of these kinds of, you know, philosophical questions about the nature of making a personal piece such as this, or set of pieces. And as Gail talked about at the beginning, that idea of what kind of relationship then are you setting up with the reader? What's your reader's expectation? What you imagine the reader's expectation is? Do they necessarily, you know, are you going to ask them to be part of your journey, or are you going to continually keep them at arm's length? Do you seek resolution, or the chaos, irresolution that is suggested by essay? All of these things and more. I love the way the book made us consider the nature of the memoir form and why it has such a hold on contemporary markets and readers as well. That's another thing that the book, you know, throws into our consciousness.
Yeah. That's right. Why do we want to read about other people's lives all the time? And what does it do for us? And I suppose I leaned into that memoirness because I felt like there were things that I really wanted to write about, not just writing about my life, but about women's lives and single parenting, and, you know, all of these things that I think don't get a lot of airtime, strangely, because there are a lot of single parents out there.
Can I be a kind of Imagine Spaces Bossy Boots and invite Ian to speak? Ian,
Really?
you're there.
Oh, I mean, I've only read I've only read maybe 100 pages or so. So I've not read the entire work. I don't know. But obviously I've been scribbling for the last few days just with this and that, to the extent that it's chaotic. I can't quite read any of it out. But my thoughts based on chaos, I mean, is chaos lack of order? Question, you know? And I'm just thinking of the affinity between chaos and biodiversity, and the positive force that chaos has in nature. There was a wonderful film several years ago. It had chaos in the title. It was about gardening. I don't know if you remember. I can't remember the title or much about it at the moment. But yeah, I think that there is something quite desirable about chaos, you know. But in terms of imagined spaces, I was thinking just in the initial phase of the book at the beginning in Edinburgh, as the streets quieten, you know, and the poet, you, Lynn, as the poet and the conjurer, you know, things begin to happen, you know, like the Royal Mile with its little side vennels and streets, and what begins to emerge, the chaos that begins to emerge from there in your imagination, you know, your perception, the consciousness that begins to form. And that is, I suppose, as a crossover piece of writing that suggests memoir, but really begins tugging essayistically, you know, at other topics. But I suppose I was thinking in terms of imagined space and the physical space and the conjurings before and during lockdown, how they became like haunted spaces. And I think I was comparing that with my own experiences of lockdown and not being able to leave my own space, albeit Partick in Glasgow at the time, you know. Yeah, it was, yeah. For me, I guess it was very much like an imagined space, you know. What you wrote was, it sort of filled me with lots of sort of ideas about many different things. You know, sorry, I'm rambling, you know. Um, yeah.
Thinking about what you were saying about chaos there. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, but just also I was aware of the emptiness as well, you know, and you know, in the emptiness, how you filled it, you know, or what you filled it with, you know, what you conjured up in that space, you know. And you created from that chaos something that was quite positive and life affirming, you know, through your own imaginings and also through your memories and connecting with the past through your diary entries, your associations, how you brought your family with you from New Zealand, you know, how you were isolated and couldn't contact them, you know, and that sense of place being a space, which, as you said, it's not. I think at some point in New Zealand, you're quite tentative in how you describe that, but also you don't think that home is a place, but more of a space, that sense of space, and you create that, I think, in your writing, you know, yeah, which is a very crossover piece of writing, you know, extended piece of writing, you know. Anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was too much of your time there. Sorry. Yeah.
No, that was interesting because I'm very interested in what place is and how we carry it with us and how we create it and how language is at the heart of place. In fact, I'm writing essays at the moment around that. So I suppose I haven't finished writing this book.
I suppose in a sense it's a bit of a maundering, you know, although not entirely, because you were quite calculated and everything you did. You were very precise, but the overall there's a sort of maundering, you know, sense, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway. It was a lovely piece of writing. I mean, real presence and empathy, you know, real authenticity, you know, I felt, you know, from what I read, you know. I liked it a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. What came into my mind when you were talking about chaos before was the fires in Australia that not the ones that burn out of control, but the controlled fires that, you know, Indigenous Australians always lit to reinvigorate the forests, so the seeds could grow once the trees had been burnt. This was a signal for new life. And that's a type of chaos that kind of leads to a new possibility. Yeah.
I have to say, I was very excited when I read this book because what you've just said, Ian, really chimes about biodiversity. That a book of fragments and short essays and short pieces, um, you know, the fact that it's been published as a memoir becomes slightly irrelevant because I think we're all agreed it isn't strictly memoir, it's something else. And the idea of biodiversity really hits the nail on the head because it's lots of different things, short pieces, fragments, but there are threads and themes that travel through it because it's about travel and it's about space and it's about distance and it's about relationship and it's about so many things, looked at in different ways and written about in different ways, and all the while listening and hearing and hearing your own writing and hearing the voices from the past and hearing the past coming up and meeting the present and the distances coming together. It's altogether something different. And that excited me because I like writing little bits and pieces of this and that. But, how do you make a book out of that? Well, you just did. And I think that's a great thing.
Keep writing the bits and pieces. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-mm.
I think that might be a really lovely point at which to end this discussion, Jeannie and Lynn, it's so lovely having you in conversation about all of these matters because Jeannie, Lynn, writes the most beautiful bits and pieces. And Gail and I have been kind of slyly, quietly, and sometimes quite bullishly saying, please, can we have more and more of them? Because there's no doubt that at some point, these little bits and pieces can all come together in the most beautiful sense of archipelago or constellation or something. I love the idea of spaces between the bits as well, which of course we haven't really got onto tonight as well. But I wonder, in our last 5 minutes, there was talk of us closing. It's because it's such a lovely thing to have a writer reading her own work as part of our Imagine Spaces sessions. And I wonder if this one might finish with you reading a couple of paragraphs, Lynn, from this stimulating book that has made us ask so many questions and have such a fantastic conversation tonight. Thank you both so much.
Thanks so much, Kirsty. It's been amazing being here, so thank you for inviting me, Kirsty and Gail and Jeannie. So I'm going to read this little piece that I think Jeannie wanted me to read, which is called In the Absence of the Otter. I caught a bus from the centre of Edinburgh out to Musselburgh because I wanted to walk by the River Esk and wash some clouds out of my head. I wanted birds over brute words. There'd been some violence at work. I wanted birds over buses, their stops and starts, and the deep, anxious sound of suitcases being wheeled places, which is the ground note, the urla of the city's song. I wanted the grace notes. It was an hour to get there, and as the bus stopped and started, I thought of how I saw an otter once at the river. I thought of wild garlic and brambles and tumbled several seasons into one. I got off by the police station and walked to the crest of a hill where a church is, and saw in one deep-set window St. Bride with St. Midwinner, and this other woman in scant outline squeezed off to the side, Sister Dara. I took a picture, and then I walked down to the river. But it felt like a reenactment with no otter. I sat riverside, and I'm not going to rhyme that with cried. On the way home, but not yet out of Musselburgh, the honest tune, a high man walked in front of the bus. The bus stopped suddenly, and a woman slid off her seat and right down the middle aisle. The high man wasn't hurt, just high, but he said he wanted to die. We sat there waiting for the police to come, and I thought about St. Bride. And what about Sister Dara sort of expiring at the edge of everything? I took out my phone and looked at their faces. I started to research. Sister Dara was a blind nun who, when her sight was restored by St. Bride, didn't want it. She asked to be returned to the beauty of darkness.
Mm.
Thank you.
Well, there's some chaos upon which to end a really fantastic session. Thank you again so much, Jeannie, for hosting this wonderful conversation, Lynn, for being our special guest. It's just been a treat, and I'm speaking on behalf of all of us. And yeah, I think you've given us a great deal to think about this evening. Thank you again.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very welcome. Thank you.
It's been lovely to meet you, Lynn.
Thank you.
There we go. And I've stopped the recording. There we go.